The bridge of the Valiant hummed with quiet efficiency as Commander Jake Morrison watched the stars slide past the viewport. Mars hung in the distance, a red jewel against the black canvas of space. It was supposed to be another routine patrol, another ordinary day in the year 2287. Lieutenant Amy Collins sat at her station, monitoring subspace frequencies with practiced ease. She had been doing this job for 3 years and never expected anything unusual to happen. Then her screen flickered. Amy leaned forward, her fingers dancing across the controls as she tried to isolate the signal. It was weak, barely stronger than background radiation, and it came from somewhere far beyond known space. She enhanced the signal, filtered out the noise, and listened. What she heard made her blood run cold. It was a voice, distorted and desperate, repeating the same words over and over in broken universal standard. "Help us, they come. We die. Please." Amy's hands shook as she routed the signal to Morrison's command chair. The commander listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each repetition. He ordered the ship's artificial intelligence to begin analysis while summoning Dr. Helen Price from the linguistics lab. Helen arrived within minutes, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her sharp eyes already analyzing the waveform patterns on the displays around her. For 6 hours, Helen and her team worked to decipher the message. The language was unlike anything in human databases, built on tonal variations and harmonic frequencies that suggested the speakers lived in a liquid environment. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced together more than just the desperate plea. They learned the speakers called themselves the Zinthari. They learned their homeworld was being attacked by invaders they called the Bracken. They learned that millions were dying, and that this transmission was likely their last hope. Morrison sent the recording to Earth immediately. The United Earth Council convened within hours, filling the view screen in his ready room with 24 faces representing every nation and colony. Admiral Lisa Carter spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of command. She argued that humanity had a moral obligation to respond. Others disagreed. Counselor Gregory Hunt reminded everyone that Earth's fleet was stretched thin protecting the colonies, that engaging in an unknown conflict light years away could leave humanity vulnerable. The debate raged for hours. Morrison listened, growing increasingly frustrated with the political maneuvering. Finally, he interrupted. He told them about a day 40 years ago when he was just a boy. He told them about the Krillian raiders who attacked the outer colonies, about how Earth's defenses were overwhelmed, about how millions would have died if a passing merchant fleet hadn't intervened. He told them that humanity existed today because someone else had chosen to help strangers in need. The council chamber fell silent. The vote was called. The motion passed by a narrow margin. Earth would respond to the Zenthari distress call. Within 72 hours, the largest fleet ever assembled by humanity gathered in Mars orbit. 3 Dreadnought-class warships formed the core. Morrison commanded the Valiant, while Captain Nathan Wright took the Thunderstrike and Captain Olivia Bennett led the Horizon Dawn. These ships were monsters, each one over 1 kilometer long and bristling with enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. Supporting them were 12 destroyers, 6 medical frigates equipped to handle mass casualties, and 2 massive carriers loaded with fighter squadrons. Engineer Chief Alex Turner worked around the clock, inspecting every system on every ship. He was a perfectionist who accepted nothing less than complete readiness. His teams checked weapons, engines, life support, and the experimental quantum slip drives that would carry the fleet across 47 light-years in just 3 weeks. The drives were new technology, barely tested, but they were humanity's only hope of arriving in time to make a difference. The fleet departed on a cold Tuesday morning. 15,000 personnel said goodbye to families they might never see again. They knew the risks. They knew they might be flying into a battle they couldn't win, but they also knew that if they didn't try, they would have to live with that choice forever. The quantum slip was unlike anything most of the crew had experienced. Reality twisted around them as the ships punched through normal space into a dimension where distance had different meanings. It wasn't comfortable. People felt dizzy, disoriented, as if their bodies existed in 2 places at once, but it worked, carrying them across the light years at speeds that should have been impossible. During the journey, Morrison held daily briefings with his senior staff. Amy continued monitoring the Zenthari signal, which grew weaker each day. Dr. Kevin Ross, the fleet's chief medical officer, prepared his teams for every contingency. He drilled them on treating injuries from energy weapons, explosive decompression, and dozens of other scenarios. Sergeant Major Claire Davis put the Marines through brutal training exercises, adapting their tactics for the possibility of fighting in aquatic environments. Lieutenant Samuel Pierce, the intelligence officer, spent his time analyzing what little data they had. He built psychological profiles of both the Zenthari and the Vraken, based on linguistic patterns and tactical behavior inferred from the distress calls. He concluded that the Zenthari were peaceful, possibly incapable of effective violence. The Vraken, by contrast, showed all the hallmarks of a predatory culture built on conquest and subjugation. 3 weeks after leaving Earth, the fleet prepared to drop out of quantum space. Morrison stood on the bridge surrounded by his crew. Amy sat at her station, her hands steady now despite the fear she felt. The countdown began. 10 seconds. 5. 1. The universe snapped back into focus and they found themselves at the edge of the Zenthari system. What they saw made even hardened veterans catch their breath. Debris fields surrounded 3 beautiful water worlds that shone like sapphires. The debris was clearly the remains of ships, stations, and habitats. Massive dark vessels orbited the planets like vultures, their angular designs speaking of a culture that valued intimidation. These were the Vraken. The enemy detected them immediately. A transmission came through, audio only, in Universal Standard that was perfectly clear. The voice was deep and full of contempt. It identified itself as Warlord Krayax, commander of the Vraken conquest fleet. He told the humans to leave immediately or be destroyed. He said the Zenthari belonged to the Vraken now, that this system was claimed territory and that interfering would mean war. Morrison looked at Amy, at Alex, at all the faces on his bridge. He saw determination, not fear. He opened a channel and kept his response simple. We're here for the Zenthari. Stand down, or we'll go through you. Krax's laughter echoed through the bridge speakers. The transmission cut off. The Vraken ships began moving into attack formation. Morrison gave his orders calmly, his voice steady. Battle stations. All ships, combat formation Delta. Fighters launch when ready. His crew moved with practiced efficiency, their training taking over. The Valiant's weapon systems came online, the railguns charging with a hum that resonated through the hull. In the distance, the Vraken fleet advanced. They outnumbered the humans 3-1. They had conquered 47 worlds and crushed every opponent they'd ever faced. They had no reason to expect these new aliens to be any different. They were about to learn why Earth was called a death world. The Vraken ships moved with confidence, their formation loose and arrogant. Warlord Krayax had fought hundreds of battles and never tasted defeat. His fleet consisted of 42 heavy cruisers, each one a proven killer that had participated in the conquest of at least 3 worlds. Against his armada, the human fleet looked pathetically small. Just 3 large ships, some smaller escorts, and a handful of tiny craft that could barely qualify as threats. Krax decided to make this quick and painful, a lesson to any other foolish species that might consider interfering with Vraken expansion. Morrison watched the enemy approach with calm eyes. He had spent 20 years in the Navy, fighting pirates, raiders, and rival corporations in the Belt Wars. He knew how to read an opponent. The Vraken were overconfident, their formation showing clear gaps in their point defense coverage. They expected an easy victory. That would be their first mistake. The distance closed. 200,000 kilometers, 100,000, 50,000. The Vraken opened fire first, as Morrison knew they would. Plasma torpedoes streaked across the void, brilliant orange trails against the black. Energy beams followed. Concentrated lances of power meant to overwhelm shields and boil armor. The weapons struck the human fleet's defensive screens, causing them to flare bright blue. The impacts were tremendous, each one releasing enough energy to power a city for a year. The shields held. Human defensive technology was built on lessons learned from centuries of warfare, refined through countless iterations and backed by the industrial might of an entire solar system. The Vraken weapons were powerful, but they were designed to fight opponents who had never needed strong defenses. The Zenthari had been peaceful. The 47 other species the Vraken conquered had been weak. Humanity was neither. Morrison gave the order. Fire. The Valiant's main railgun spoke. There was no sound in space, but the ship shuddered as massive projectiles were accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. Each round was a solid slug of depleted uranium jacketed in tungsten, weighing 2 tons and moving at speeds that made them nearly impossible to intercept. The kinetic energy they carried was apocalyptic. The first round struck a Vraken cruiser amidships. The ship's shields absorbed the first impact, flared, and collapsed. The second and third rounds punched through the hull like it was paper. The cruiser broke apart, its reactor containment failing and adding a brief new sun to the battlefield. The Vraken formation hesitated, suddenly uncertain. They had never faced weapons like this. Captain Nathan Wright on the Thunderstrike saw the opening. He ordered his ship and its escort group to flank the enemy formation, using their superior speed to slide around the Vraken defensive line. The destroyers, smaller and more agile than the Dreadnoughts, darted forward like wolves harrying a herd. Commander Peter Walsh led the destroyer group with precision, his ships firing in coordinated volleys that overwhelmed individual Vraken vessels before they could adapt. The Vraken tried to compensate, redirecting ships to counter the flanking maneuver. That left their center weak. Captain Olivia Bennett on the Horizon Dawn drove straight into that weakness, her Dreadnought's armor absorbing hits that would have destroyed lesser ships. Her railguns fired continuously, each shot precisely calculated by the ship's targeting AI. More Vraken cruisers died, their hulls torn open, their crews exposed to vacuum. The fighter squadrons launched from the carriers were a revelation. Each fighter was a masterpiece of human engineering, small enough to evade capital ship weapons but carrying enough firepower to threaten much larger vessels. Wing Commander Nicole Grant led the first wave personally, her neural interface allowing her to control her craft with thought-speed precision. Human reflexes honed by evolution on a world where predators hunted from every shadow were already superior to most species. Enhanced by technology, they became supernatural. The fighters dove through the Vraken formation like sharks through a school of fish. They targeted the joints between ship sections, the engine clusters, the weapon emplacements. Their missiles were small but carried shaped nuclear charges that could crack armor. Their energy weapons were efficient, designed for sustained fire rather than overwhelming alpha strikes. The Vraken point defense systems tried to track them but failed. The human pilots were simply too fast, too unpredictable, too aggressive. Warlord Krayax watched his fleet die and could not comprehend what was happening. His tactical display showed ship after ship going dark, their life signs winking out as human weapons found vital systems. He ordered his remaining vessels to concentrate fire on the largest human ship, the one called Valiant. Every weapon in his fleet that could reach turned toward Morrison's command. The Valiant's shields blazed like a star under the concentrated barrage. Alarms screamed across the bridge. Amy gripped her console as the ship shook. Alex was already rerouting power, pulling energy from non-essential systems and feeding it to the shields. The temperature on the bridge climbed as heat bleed-through overwhelmed the cooling systems. But the shields held. They held because humanity had learned through bitter experience that survival in space required resilience above all else. Morrison ordered the Valiant to return fire with everything. All railguns, all missile tubes, all energy weapons unleashed at once. The targeting computers had identified Krayax's flagship based on the command frequency of the orders being broadcast. The combined firepower of a human dreadnought focused on a single target was staggering. Krayax's ship tried to evade, but it was too massive, too slow. The rounds hit. The flagship's shields collapsed after the third impact. The fourth and fifth penetrated the hull. The sixth struck something critical. The explosion was visible across the system. Krayax's flagship simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding cloud of plasma and debris. The Vraken fleet lost cohesion. Ships began trying to retreat, their captains suddenly realizing they were not facing prey but predators. Morrison did not let them run. He ordered the fleet to pursue to finish this. He knew that allowing survivors to escape would only mean more battles later, more deaths, more suffering. The battle lasted 2 hours total. When it ended, 38 Vraken cruisers were destroyed or disabled. Only 4 escaped, their engines burning at maximum as they fled for the edge of the system and the safety of quantum space. The human fleet had suffered damage, some of it serious, but not a single ship was lost. The casualty count was remarkably low, fewer than 300 wounded and only 12 dead. Morrison convened a command meeting. The holographic display in his ready room showed the faces of his captains and senior officers. The plan was straightforward. The Marines would conduct drop assaults on all 3 worlds simultaneously. They would target the major Vrakan strongholds. The goal was liberation, not extermination. Claire's Marines prepared for the assault with grim efficiency. Private Lucas Shaw was nervous, this being his first real combat operation. The drop pods launched, small armored vehicles designed to punch through atmosphere. Lucas's pod hit the surface hard. The front panel blew off and he charged out into an alien world. The fighting was brutal and close, but human-powered armor made each Marine stronger, faster, and nearly invulnerable to enemy weapons. The battle for the cities lasted 5 days. When it ended, the Zenthari were free. The liberation of the Zenthari worlds changed everything. Within a week, the Vrakan occupation forces were either dead, captured, or in full retreat. The human Marines had fought through every stronghold, cleared every facility, and freed every prisoner. But victory on the battlefield was just the beginning. The real work started after the guns fell silent. Dr. Kevin Ross and his medical teams worked 20-hour days treating the wounded. The Zenthari had suffered terribly under Vrakan occupation. Thousands were injured, malnourished, or sick from diseases that spread through the overcrowded detention facilities. The human doctors had never treated Zenthari before, had no baseline medical data to work from, but they adapted quickly. Kevin personally performed the first successful surgery on a Zenthari elder, whose internal organs were failing. The procedure took 18 hours and required him to learn an entirely new anatomy on the fly. Engineer Chief Alex Turner coordinated the reconstruction effort. The Vrakan had damaged critical infrastructure during their invasion and occupation. Water purification systems were offline. Power generation facilities were destroyed. Transportation networks between the floating cities were severed. Alex's teams worked alongside Zenthari engineers to repair everything. He quickly developed respect for Zenthari technical knowledge. They understood energy systems and quantum mechanics in ways that made human science look primitive. Dr. Helen Price established the first real communication protocols with the Zenthari. She learned their language, their customs, their history. The Zenthari had been spacefaring for over 2,000 years, but had never encountered hostility until the Vrakan came. They had explored, traded, and shared knowledge freely with every species they met. The concept of war was so foreign to them that they had no cultural framework for understanding it. Speaker Lorian was the Zenthari equivalent of a leader, though the title was more like chief diplomat than ruler. He met with Commander Morrison aboard the Valiant 3 weeks after liberation. Lorian was old, his translucent skin showing the passage of time through the dimming of his bioluminescence. He moved slowly, gracefully, his large eyes taking in everything about the human ship. Morrison escorted him personally to the observation deck. The two of them stood looking out at the 3 water worlds, now free and beginning to heal. Lorian asked the question that had been bothering him since the first human ship arrived. "Why did you come? You did not know us. We offered you nothing. You risked everything to save strangers. Why?" Morrison thought about his answer carefully. He told Lorian about Earth, about how humanity had nearly destroyed itself countless times through war, disease, and environmental catastrophe. He told him about the Krillian raiders and how a merchant fleet had intervened when Earth needed help. He told him that humanity had learned a hard lesson over and over again through its bloody history. The lesson was that civilization survived not through strength alone, but through the willingness of the strong to protect the weak. "We came because you called for help," Morrison said, "and because we could." Lorian was silent for a long time. Then he made a formal request. The Zenthari wanted to form an alliance with humanity. They offered their technological knowledge, their resources, their eternal friendship. In return, they asked for protection and the chance to learn from humans how to defend themselves. Morrison explained that he had no authority to make such agreements. He contacted Earth immediately. The United Earth Council reconvened. Admiral Lisa Carter supported the alliance strongly. Counselor Gregory Hunt was more cautious. He worried about making enemies across the galaxy by allying with the Zenthari. The Vrakan would surely retaliate. Other species might see humanity as a threat. The debate was fierce but shorter than before. In the end, the Council voted to accept the Zenthari proposal. The alliance was formalized with ceremonies on both Earth and the Zenthari homeworld. Lieutenant Samuel Pierce had been analyzing data from captured Vrakan computers. What he found was disturbing. The Vrakan were not an isolated threat. They were part of a much larger empire that controlled hundreds of systems. The invasion fleet destroyed by Morrison represented less than 5% of their total military strength. Even more concerning, The Vraken were not the only predatory species in the galaxy. He also learned something else that explained much about the galactic situation. Most spacefaring species had evolved on what the Vraken called garden worlds, planets with mild weather, low gravity, and few natural predators. These species developed intelligence and technology, but never developed the physical toughness or aggressive tendencies that came from surviving in hostile environments. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so dangerous that complex life should not have been possible. Humanity was an anomaly, a species that combined advanced technology with the physical capabilities of an apex predator. The Galactic Council became aware of humanity's intervention in the Xanthari crisis through their vast network of observers and informants. The Council was a federation of peaceful species that had existed for thousands of years. They maintained neutrality in all conflicts, believing that involvement would only lead to more violence. Ambassador Talia Wright had traveled with the fleet specifically to handle diplomatic issues. She received a message from Council Overseer Zenith Prime. The Council was displeased. They considered the human intervention in Xanthari space to be an unauthorized military action. They demanded that human forces withdraw from Xanthari space immediately and threatened sanctions if Earth did not comply. Talia read the message 3 times before responding. Her draft firmly rejected the Council's position. She pointed out that the Xanthari had requested help, that the Vraken were the aggressors, and that the Council's neutrality had allowed untold suffering across the galaxy. She asked what good was peace for the Council if it meant death and slavery for everyone else. The response from Zenith Prime was predictable. The Council insisted that maintaining neutrality was the only way to prevent galaxy-wide war, and that humanity's aggressive tendencies made them a potential threat to established order. Reading between the lines, Talia understood the real message. The Council was afraid. News of humanity's actions spread through unofficial channels much faster than through diplomatic ones. Traders carried stories. Information brokers sold details. Refugees from Vraken territory spoke of the humans who came when called and destroyed an entire invasion fleet. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legends. Humanity became known by a new name in the galactic community. They called them Deathworlders, the ones who answered distress calls with battle fleets, the ones who brought dreadnoughts when others brought only words. For peaceful species oppressed by aggressive neighbors, this was hope. For predatory empires used to easy conquests, this was a threat. The Karathi were the first to reach out to humanity directly. They were an insectoid species who had once controlled a large territory before the Vraken conquered them. Their leader, a being called Hikari, sent an encrypted message to Ambassador Talia. The message contained detailed intelligence on Vraken fleet movements, base locations, and military capabilities. Other contacts followed. The Elysian traders offered to supply rare materials for human ship construction. The Thrin Republic sent an envoy to Earth proposing military cooperation. The envoy, General Vorath, explained that his people respected strength and courage. They had observed humanity's actions in Xanthari space and wished to learn more about these remarkable Deathworlders. Morrison spent 6 months in Xanthari space, overseeing the final stages of reconstruction and training the first Xanthari Defense Forces. Claire's Marines became instructors, teaching Xanthari volunteers basic combat skills and tactical thinking. It was slow going. The Xanthari found violence deeply disturbing, but they learned because survival demanded it. 6 months after the liberation of the Xanthari worlds, long-range sensors detected a massive fleet entering the outer edges of the system. The fleet was enormous, over 400 ships strong, and they were all broadcasting Vraken identification codes. Supreme War Master Draxus had come to reclaim what he considered his property, and to teach the humans a lesson about interfering in Vraken affairs. Morrison had expected this. He had been preparing for it since the day the first Vraken ship was destroyed. He sent an immediate alert to Earth and activated the defensive protocols he had spent months implementing. The orbital defense platforms came online, their massive energy weapons powered by Xanthari quantum reactors. The human fleet, reinforced with newly arrived ships from Earth, took up defensive positions. But even with reinforcements, Morrison commanded only 23 capital ships against over 400. Admiral Lisa Carter received Morrison's alert while reviewing construction schedules in the Mars orbital yards. She had been expecting this moment as well. Over the past 6 months, Earth's industrial capacity had been pushed to its absolute limits. Every shipyard in the solar system was building warships. The entire human economy had shifted to a war footing. Lisa activated the mobilization plan she had been refining since the first battle. Within hours, orders went out to every human ship capable of making the journey. The United Earth Navy would deploy its full strength to defend the Xanthari. 53 dreadnoughts, over 200 destroyers, and countless support vessels began preparations for immediate departure. Ambassador Talia had been working diplomatic channels relentlessly since returning to Earth. She had cultivated relationships with dozens of species, always with an eye toward building a coalition against aggressive empires like the Vraken. Now she activated those relationships. Her first call went to General Vorath of the Thryn Republic. The Thryn had been observing humanity carefully. When Talia requested military assistance, the Thryn High Command agreed immediately. They dispatched 37 warships, smaller than human dreadnoughts but heavily armed and crewed by warriors who had been fighting for centuries. The Karathi resistance provided intelligence that proved invaluable. Hikari's network had infiltrated Vraken command structures and stole the complete battle plan for the invasion. Morrison received this information and used it to position his forces perfectly. The Vraken expected to find a small defensive fleet and unprepared colonies. Instead, they would face a coordinated defense backed by the largest human fleet ever deployed. Engineer Chief Alex worked with Xanthari scientists to complete the orbital defense platforms. These massive structures were revolutionary, combining human weapons technology with Xanthari energy systems. Each platform could generate a sustained energy beam capable of cutting through a capital ship's armor. 20 platforms ringed the 3 Xanthari worlds, each one a fortress in space. The waiting was difficult. Everyone knew the Vraken were coming. Morrison used the time to drill his fleet relentlessly. The Thryn ships integrated into the human formations smoothly, their crews adapting to human tactical doctrine with impressive speed. Jack Coleman was among the new pilots who had joined the fleet. He was young, just 23, but he had scored perfectly in every training simulation. Jack's parents had died when Krillian raiders attacked the mining colony where they worked. He had been 8 years old and remembered everything. He joined the Navy as soon as he was old enough. The Vraken fleet arrived exactly when the probes predicted. Supreme War Master Draxus broadcast a message on all frequencies. His voice was confident, almost amused. He gave humanity one final chance to surrender the Xanthari worlds and withdraw. In exchange, he promised to merely enslave humanity's colonies rather than exterminating them. Morrison recorded his response carefully. He thanked Draxus for the warning and the extra time to prepare. He explained that humanity had faced extinction events before and always survived. He pointed out that Draxus was outnumbered by defenders who knew exactly what they were defending. And then he delivered the final line. "You came here expecting prey. You found predators," Draxus laughed. The transmission ended. The Vraken fleet advanced in a massive formation. Morrison gave the order to engage when the enemy reached weapons range. The orbital platforms fired first, their energy beams reaching across space to strike the leading Vraken ships. The beams were continuous, sustained fire that kept pouring energy into targets until they broke apart. The human fleet did not wait passively. Morrison ordered an aggressive forward defense, bringing his dreadnoughts out to meet the enemy. The Thryn ships formed up on the human flanks. Captain Nathan Wright led a battle group that punched through the Vraken lines. Wing Commander Nicole Grant led fighter squadrons in coordinated strikes against enemy command ships. Jack flew his fighter with a precision that impressed his squadron leader. He seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened. During the 3rd hour of battle, his squadron was tasked with destroying a massive Vraken carrier. Jack volunteered to lead the attack. He dodged through a storm of defensive fire, his fingers dancing across the controls. He released his missiles at point-blank range, then pulled away sharply. When his vision cleared, the carrier was breaking apart. Sergeant Claire Davis commanded the defense forces on the Xanthari homeworld itself. If the Vraken broke through the orbital defenses, they would attempt ground landings. Claire had prepared for this possibility extensively. The Xanthari cities had been fortified. Sergeant Lucas Shaw led one of the defensive units. He had spent 6 months training the Xanthari and knew they were ready. The battle raged for 3 days without pause. Both sides took horrific casualties. Human ships were destroyed, their crews lost to the void. Thryn warships fought until their hulls were breached. On the second day, the Horizon Dawn took concentrated fire from 6 Vraken heavy cruisers. Captain Olivia Bennett ordered her crew to abandon ship while she stayed at her post. She died along with 200 crew members who refused to leave their captain, but the defenders held. The orbital platforms continued firing. The human fleet adapted to every Vraken tactic. The Thryn ships proved their worth repeatedly. General Vorath personally commanded from the bridge of his flagship, directing his ships with the skill of someone who had fought in hundreds of battles. On the 4th day, something changed in the Vraken fleet. Their attacks became less coordinated, more desperate. Draxus had lost over half his ships. He ordered a final all-out assault, committing every remaining vessel, including his flagship. Morrison saw the opportunity. He ordered the entire human fleet to focus fire on Draxus's ship. The Vraken flagship died hard, its thick armor and powerful shields absorbing punishment that would have destroyed a dozen smaller ships. But under sustained fire from an entire fleet, nothing could survive. The flagship broke apart, and Supreme War Master Draxus died, never understanding how these unknown aliens had defeated him. With their leader dead and their fleet shattered, the remaining Vraken ships fled. The defenders did not pursue this time. They were too exhausted, too bloodied. But they had won. The aftermath of the Battle of Zenthari Prime was sobering. The human fleet had lost 12 dreadnoughts, including the Horizon Dawn. Over 8,000 personnel died in the fighting. The Thryn lost 11 ships and thousands of their warriors. The Zenthari worlds were saved, but the cost was staggering. Memorial services were held across human space and on every Thryn colony world. Speaker Lorien proposed building a monument in orbit around the Zenthari homeworld. The monument would be a massive structure visible from the surface, inscribed with the name of every human and Thryn who died defending worlds that were not their own. Construction began immediately, with Zenthari artisans and human engineers working together. The monument became a place of pilgrimage, where beings from across the Alliance came to remember. Dr. Kevin Ross worked around the clock treating the wounded. The medical frigates were overwhelmed with casualties. Kevin performed over 40 surgeries in 3 days, but he could not save everyone. He stood by the bedside of a young pilot named Jack Coleman, who had been pulled from his destroyed fighter. Jack's injuries were too severe. In his final moments, Jack asked Kevin if they had won, if the Zenthari were safe. Kevin told him yes. Jack smiled and closed his eyes for the last time. The political consequences of the battle spread across the galaxy. The Vraken Empire began to fragment as subjugated worlds saw an opportunity for rebellion. If the mighty Vraken could be defeated twice by the same enemy, perhaps they were not invincible. Uprisings began on a dozen worlds simultaneously. The Karathi resistance launched coordinated attacks on Vraken facilities. The Galactic Council could no longer ignore what was happening. They had maintained neutrality for thousands of years, believing it kept peace across the galaxy. But their neutrality had allowed aggressive species to expand unchecked. The Council's credibility was shattered. Several member species withdrew, declaring that they would seek protection from those actually willing to provide it. Ambassador Talia led the negotiations that followed. She proposed a new organization, the Alliance of Free Worlds, dedicated to mutual defense and the protection of peaceful species from aggressive expansion. The founding members were humanity, the Zenthari, and the Thryn Republic. Within weeks, 12 other species requested membership. The Alliance was not a military empire. It was a coalition of equals bound by shared values. The Galactic Council reluctantly recognized the Alliance of Free Worlds. They had no choice. The Alliance controlled significant territory and possessed military power that exceeded most member states of the Council. A new treaty was negotiated that established rules for intervention in conflicts. The principle of non-interference was modified to allow defensive actions when requested. It was a small change but represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy operated. Admiral Lisa Carter received new orders from the United Earth Council. Humanity was establishing the Frontier Defense Fleet, a permanent force dedicated to responding to distress calls and defending Alliance members. Morrison was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of this new fleet. The flagship of the Frontier Defense Fleet was a new Dreadnought, the largest and most advanced ship humanity had ever built. It was christened the Resolute. The Resolute incorporated every lesson learned from the battles with the Vraken. Its armor was thicker, its weapons more powerful, its shield stronger. But more importantly, it was built using hybrid technology, combining human engineering with Zenthari energy systems and Thrin metallurgy. Lieutenant Amy Collins became Morrison's executive officer. She continued monitoring subspace frequencies, listening for distress calls that might need their attention. The communications equipment on the Resolute was the most sensitive ever built, capable of detecting signals across dozens of light years. Engineer Chief Alex Turner was promoted to Chief of Naval Engineering for the entire Alliance fleet. He oversaw the construction of new ships and the upgrade of existing vessels. He worked closely with Zenthari scientists who had made breakthrough after breakthrough in energy generation and faster-than-light travel. Wing Commander Nicole Grant took command of all fighter operations for the Frontier Defense Fleet. She trained pilots from multiple species, teaching them human tactics while learning from their unique perspectives. Together they formed squadrons that were more effective than any single species could achieve alone. Sergeant Claire Davis became the commander of the Alliance Marine Corps. She oversaw the training of ground forces from multiple species, creating integrated units that could operate in any environment. Lucas Shaw was promoted to lieutenant and became one of Claire's senior officers. The Zenthari underwent the most dramatic transformation of any species in the Alliance. They remained fundamentally peaceful, but they were no longer helpless. Speaker Lorian established the Zenthari Defense Initiative, a program that trained volunteers in self-defense and military tactics. The Zenthari would never be a warrior culture, but they would never again be victims. The Thrin found in humanity a kindred spirit they had been seeking for centuries. General Voreth became a close friend of Morrison despite the species barrier. They spent hours discussing tactics, strategy, and philosophy. The cultural exchange enriched both species. 1 year after the Battle of Zenthari Prime, the Frontier Defense Fleet was officially commissioned in a ceremony attended by leaders from across the Alliance. Morrison stood on the bridge of the Resolute looking out at the assembled ships. The fleet consisted of 30 dreadnoughts, over 100 destroyers, and countless support vessels. The crews were mixed, humans working alongside Zenthari, Thrin, Karathi, and members of a dozen other species. The ceremony concluded with Speaker Lorian giving a speech that was broadcast across the entire Alliance. He spoke about the darkness that existed in the galaxy, about the predatory empires that preyed on the weak. But he also spoke about the light, about species who chose to help strangers. He spoke about the day when his people sent a desperate message into the void. And he spoke about the humans who came, who brought their dreadnoughts and their courage. Morrison stood on the bridge as the ceremony concluded, and personnel returned to their duties. The Resolute was ready. The fleet was ready. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, someone would need help. And when that call came, the Frontier Defense Fleet would be ready to respond. 3 days after the commissioning ceremony, Amy detected a signal. It was weak and came from a system 70 light-years away. The language was unknown, but the desperation was clear. They were under attack. They were dying. They needed help. Amy routed the signal to Morrison's command chair. The bridge fell silent as everyone listened. Then Morrison gave his orders: set course. Maximum speed. All ships prepare for combat operations. Medical teams, stand by for mass casualties. Marines, full combat loadout. This is not a drill. The Resolute's engines came alive. The quantum slip drives engaged, tearing a hole in space that the ship and its fleet slipped through. They raced toward a distant star system where beings they had never met were fighting for survival. They did not know what they would find. They did not know if they could win, but they knew they had to try. The dreadnoughts came through quantum space like avenging angels. Somewhere ahead, in a system they had never visited, a species they had never met was about to learn what humanity had taught the galaxy. When you send a distress call into the void, you might just get an answer. And that answer might arrive in the form of warships crewed by Deathworlders who refused to let anyone face extinction alone. The Resolute and its fleet dropped out of quantum space. Sensors detected the battle raging around the inner planets. Unknown ships were bombarding population centers. Morrison studied the tactical display for 3 seconds. All ships weapons free. Protect the innocents. Engage the enemy. The human dreadnoughts, the Thrin warships, the Zenthari support vessels charged forward. Because that was what the Alliance did. That was what Deathworlders did. They heard the call and they brought the Dreadnoughts. They always would.